"Here's a little something since you can't afford gifts this year," my mother said on Christmas morning, handing me a check written for $100 with the kind of sympathy in her voice that made it clear this gesture was less about generosity and more about pity. Pity for her daughter who apparently made poor life choices and was now struggling to maintain basic financial stability. We were sitting in the living room of my parents' modest suburban home in Columbus, Ohio, surrounded by carefully wrapped presents from my younger brother and sister, expensive gifts that my parents had purchased with obvious care and consideration, gifts that had clearly cost substantially more than $100. Gifts that were positioned as evidence of my siblings' capability to provide and succeed, while my mother's pity check suggested I was somehow not capable of basic adult functioning in the way that mattered to my family. The check was handed to me with accompanying commentary that made my mother's assumptions absolutely clear. "We know things have been tight for you lately. Your father and I just wanted to help you out a little bit. Don't feel bad about not having anything for us this year. We completely understand, sweetheart. Not everyone can afford to give meaningful gifts, and that's okay." The way she said it, that gentle, pitying tone, made it devastatingly clear that tight was her generous interpretation of my financial situation, that she actually believed I was struggling significantly, that she was performing maternal sympathy for a child she viewed as fundamentally unsuccessful in the ways that actually mattered in life. My father had nodded in agreement, adding his own comment about how they were just glad you were managing okay and how they were here for you if you ever need financial help. My sister had exchanged a look with my brother that suggested they were also operating under the assumption that I was doing poorly financially. That I was the one sibling who hadn't quite figured out how to be a successful adult. I'd accepted the check with a smile and a thank you, the same way I'd been accepting pity and misunderstanding from my family for years, the same way I'd been letting them believe that I was doing poorly financially when in fact I was operating at a level of wealth that they couldn't actually conceptualize. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the last 15 years building an investment portfolio worth approximately $340 million, that I'd made strategic financial decisions that had positioned me as someone who could literally purchase almost anything I wanted without even noticing the expense, that my parents' dream house, the 1920s colonial they'd been discussing and daydreaming about moving into for the past 20 years, was the kind of property that I could acquire with less than 1% of my liquid assets without impacting my financial position in any meaningful way. So I decided to use that $100 check as the foundation for something that would fundamentally alter how my family understood my actual financial situation and my actual capabilities. My name is Alexandra Pierce and I'm 43 years old. Which means I've lived long enough to understand that the people closest to you, the people who've known you your entire life, often have the least accurate understanding of who you actually are and what you've actually accomplished. I come from a genuinely middle-class background, the kind of family that was stable but not wealthy, comfortable but not privileged. My father, Mark, spent 40 years working in manufacturing management for a Fortune 500 company. My mother, Susan, worked in school administration for the Columbus public school system. They were responsible, hardworking people who provided adequately for their 3 children in a stable, predictable way. But they were also people who measured success in very specific narrow terms. Traditional careers with clear hierarchies, visible income that could be easily understood by their social circle, the kind of achievement that could be announced to other people and immediately comprehended by those around them. When I told my parents after graduating from college that I was going to pursue investing rather than pursuing a more traditional career path, something like accounting or finance at an established firm, their response was supportive in the way parents try to be, but deeply skeptical underneath that support. My father asked me repeatedly if I'd be okay financially, whether I shouldn't have a real job as a backup plan just in case the investing didn't work out. My mother suggested that I might want to consider teaching or nursing, fields where success was more obvious and visible, where the income was stable and predictable and understandable to her friends at book club. I'd pursued investing anyway, not out of rebellion exactly, but out of genuine intellectual fascination with how financial markets actually worked, how value was created and destroyed in real time, how wealth actually accumulated over decades through disciplined decision-making. I'd read every book I could find about investing strategy. I'd taken online courses from established investors. I'd studied financial analysis with the intensity of someone preparing for a critical exam. I started with the modest sum of money I managed to save while working part-time jobs through college, approximately $3,200, that represented nearly 3 years of wages from campus work and summer employment. Over 30 years, through careful analysis of market trends, disciplined decision-making that would make most people uncomfortable with risk, and a willingness to take calculated financial risks that most of my peers wouldn't even consider, I'd transformed that initial $3,200 into an investment portfolio worth approximately $340 million. I'd owned commercial real estate properties across 7 states, residential properties in high appreciation markets, significant equity positions in startup companies that had eventually gone public or been acquired, various securities including stocks and bonds, and a diversified collection of assets that generated consistent returns regardless of broader market conditions. But I'd never told my family any of this. I'd never mentioned the portfolio or discussed its size. I'd never explained the properties I owned or their value. I'd never discussed the returns I was generating or how those returns compared to traditional career incomes. I'd simply allowed them to continue believing that I was doing okay, that I was getting by, that I probably wasn't wealthy, but that I was stable enough to maintain my independence and wasn't going to burden them with financial concerns. The reasons for this deliberate invisibility were complex and somewhat interconnected. Partly, I was protective of my privacy. I'd grown up seeing how money changed family dynamics, how wealth created complications in relationships. Partly, I understood on an intuitive level that revealing my significant wealth would create complicated family dynamics that would be difficult to manage: requests for loans, expectations of generosity, assumptions about my time and resources, suggestions that I should give money to various family members or causes they supported. Partly, I was genuinely curious to see how my family would treat me if they didn't know how successful I'd actually become, whether they would respect me based on my actual accomplishments or whether they would only respect financial success if it was visible and traditional and easily measured. And partly, and I admit this with some uncomfortable self-awareness, I was angry at them. I was angry at their repeated suggestions over the years that I was making a fundamental mistake, that I needed to pursue something more traditional and established, that my choice to pursue investing full-time was somehow irresponsible or unambitious or foolish. The pity check on Christmas morning wasn't the first instance of pity I'd received from my family over the years. Over the past decade and a half, there had been subtle suggestions at family gatherings that I was making financial choices that were risky, that I probably wasn't saving enough for retirement even though I was now in my 40s, that I should probably get a real job before it was too late and my window of opportunity had completely closed. There had been comments comparing my circumstances unfavorably to my younger sister's. She was a successful physician making $350,000 annually and had therefore clearly made better life choices than I had. There had been suggestions from my brother, who worked in corporate law, that he could help me get back on track financially, as though I needed his professional guidance to sort out my money. My parents had even sent me money for my birthday several times over the years, not large amounts, usually a few $100s, but amounts that were clearly motivated by their belief that I needed financial assistance. They framed these checks as just a little something to help you out, or we know times can be tough, in ways that clearly revealed their assumption about my financial situation. I'd accepted all of it graciously, the way you do when people you love are trying to help, even if their help is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of your actual circumstances. I'd never corrected their assumptions. I'd never explained that I didn't need their money. I'd simply accepted their pity and their misunderstanding and their concern, even as it frustrated me that people who'd known me my entire life didn't actually know me at all. The $100 pity check on Christmas morning in my parents' modest suburban living room was the moment when I made a deliberate decision that the invisibility needed to end. It wasn't because the check was insulting, though it was, in its own way, insulting to be treated as financially struggling when I was actually operating at a level of wealth that most people couldn't imagine. It was because I realized in that moment that the invisibility was actually enabling my family to continue living in a version of reality that wasn't accurate. And that continuing to allow that to happen indefinitely was actually not helpful to anyone involved. That afternoon, I made phone calls to the real estate agent who'd been showing me properties in my parents' area over the past 3 years. I told her to send me everything, every listing in the county, every property that was currently on the market, every possibility that might be remotely suitable. But I specifically told her to prioritize and send me comprehensive information about one particular house, a 1920s colonial mansion with original architectural details, extensive original woodwork throughout, a beautiful wraparound porch that had appeared in a regional magazine, 5 generously sized bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, situated on 3 acres of property with a small pond, extensive gardens that would require professional maintenance, and various outbuildings including a guest house and a workshop. This was the house my parents had been talking about for 20 years, the house they'd visited dozens of times, the house they'd photographed and shown to friends, the house they discussed in wistful terms whenever the subject of retirement or future plans came up. The house was on the current market for $1.8 million, a price that reflected its historic significance, its condition, its location in one of Ohio's most desirable neighborhoods, and its position on substantial acreage. I reviewed the listing carefully. I had my financial advisor conduct a full analysis of the property, the market, and the long-term value. I had an architect inspect the structural integrity. I had the property appraised independently. Everything checked out. The property was solid. The price was fair. This was an acquisition that made financial sense. I made an offer immediately, $1.85 million, all cash, closing within 30 days, no contingencies, no financing requirements, no home inspection contingencies. The seller accepted within 48 hours. The transaction moved with the speed that comes when you have the resources to close quickly and when the buyer is representing no financing contingencies and no complicated requirements. I now own my parents' dream house. The question then became, how to present this reality to my family in a way that would actually force them to recalibrate how they understood me and my financial situation. How could I make this revelation impossible to dismiss or minimize or reinterpret through their existing assumptions? I scheduled a meeting with my parents for a Sunday afternoon, about a month after Christmas. I told them I wanted to take them somewhere, that I had a surprise planned. I didn't tell them where. I just told them to dress nicely and to meet me at a specific location at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I provided no other information, allowing them to speculate and wonder about what I might have planned. I arranged for a professional driver to pick them up from their home. I had him take them directly to the colonial house, the one they'd been talking about for 2 decades, the one they'd never been able to afford on their combined retirement and savings, the one they'd begun to accept they would probably never actually own. When the car pulled into the long driveway of the property, my mother actually gasped, an audible intake of breath that reflected genuine shock. My father sat silently beside her, staring at the house like he was trying to understand why they'd been brought to their dream house for apparently no reason, trying to make sense of a situation that didn't quite fit into any logical framework he could construct. I was standing on the wraparound porch when they arrived, leaning against one of the original columns. I was dressed simply and casually, jeans and a northwestern hoodie, nothing that would necessarily indicate my financial status or suggest the significance of what was about to happen. But I was holding an envelope that contained the original deed to the property and a full set of keys to every door in the house. "Mom, Dad," I said as they approached the porch, my voice steady and calm. "I want to show you something." I opened the front door using the key I'd had made months earlier. I took them through the house systematically, the original hardwood floors that ran throughout, the ornate crown molding in every room, the beautiful fireplace in the formal living room with its original brass fixtures, the spacious kitchen with its vintage details and original cabinetry, the 5 bedrooms on the second floor each with their own character and charm, the office on the 3rd floor that looked out over the extensive gardens and the pond beyond. They walked through the house in a kind of stunned silence, not speaking, just processing what they were seeing, trying to understand the context of this experience. My mother reached out and touched the woodwork in the hallway, her hand shaking slightly. My father walked through the kitchen with its original tile work, running his fingers along the countertops as though he was trying to confirm that this was real. When we returned to the front porch, as the afternoon light was beginning to shift toward evening, I handed them the envelope containing the deed and the full set of keys. "This is yours," I said very simply and directly. "It's the house you've been talking about moving into for the past 20 years. The house you've visited dozens of times. The house you've shown to friends. I bought it for you. The deed is in your name. It's completely paid for. There's no mortgage, no contingencies, no complications. It's yours." My mother started crying harder than I'd ever seen her cry, not sad tears, but tears of shock and disbelief and something that looked like gratitude mixed with profound confusion. "Alexandra, this is impossible. This house costs almost $2 million. Where on earth did you get this kind of money?" This doesn't make sense. Did you take out a loan? Did someone help you with this? I took a breath and told them then. I told them about the investment portfolio I'd been building for 30 years, growing it methodically from that initial $3,200 investment. I told them about the returns I'd been generating, an average annual return of approximately 18% over 3 decades, which was exceptional but not impossible with disciplined investing and careful strategic decision-making. I told them about the properties I owned across multiple states. I told them about the stocks and the bonds and the real estate investments and the startup equity that had appreciated significantly over time as those companies had succeeded and gone public or been acquired. I told them about the $340 million that represented the accumulation of 3 decades of disciplined investing, careful financial analysis, and a willingness to take calculated risks that most people wouldn't even consider. My father's reaction was shock followed by what I think was actually a kind of pride. Pride that his daughter had accomplished something this significant, pride that she'd built something real through her own work and decision-making. He asked detailed questions about my investment strategy. He wanted to understand how I'd identified opportunities. He wanted to know how I'd managed the portfolio. He seemed genuinely impressed and genuinely interested in the actual mechanics of what I'd accomplished. My mother's reaction was more complicated and more emotionally complex. There was shock, absolutely. But there was also what looked like guilt, substantial guilt that she'd been offering me pity checks when I was actually wealthy beyond their comprehension. Guilt that she'd been suggesting I was making financial mistakes when I'd actually been making some of the smartest financial decisions of anyone in the family. Guilt that she'd worried about me, that she'd pitied me, that she'd treated me as though I was struggling when I was actually doing better than they were. "How long have you known about this?" my father asked me directly. "How long have you been this successful, without telling us?" "About 15 years, I said. "I became a millionaire about 15 years ago. It took another 15 years to build it into what it is now." "Why didn't you tell us?" my mother asked, and I could hear the hurt in her voice underneath the shock and the guilt. Hurt that I'd kept this from them. Hurt that they'd been treating me like I was struggling when I was actually doing better financially than they were. Hurt that they'd missed the opportunity to understand their daughter's actual accomplishments. I considered how to answer that question honestly, because I wanted to see if you would keep loving me the same way if you didn't think I was successful. I said, because I wanted to know if your perception of me was based on actual facts or on assumptions you made about my choices and my capabilities. Because I needed to know if you would respect me based on who I actually am or based on how much money I made. What I didn't tell them, what I still haven't told them, was that the answer to those questions had been deeply disappointing. What I didn't tell them was that their pity check, their suggestions over the years that I get a real job, their implications that I was making poor financial choices, their worry about my financial stability had all revealed something important. Their respect for me was actually contingent on my success being visible and traditional and easily understood by their social circle and their friends. They owned the house. They lived in it happily for the remaining years of their lives. My mother became the woman who hosted the beautiful parties in the colonial house with the wraparound porch. My father spent his retirement years improving the gardens and restoring original details in the house, working with contractors and craftspeople to preserve its historic integrity while updating systems for modern comfort. But something fundamental between us had changed. My parents treated me differently after that day. They treated me with the kind of respect that comes from understanding that your daughter is significantly wealthier and more successful than you are. They asked for my advice on investments. They introduced me to their friends as, "My daughter Alexandra, she's a very successful investor." They positioned my financial success as a source of family pride rather than something that needed explanation or justification. But I also think they felt a kind of loss of the narrative they'd constructed about me over the years, loss of the ability to worry about me or offer me pity, loss of the simplicity of a family relationship where the hierarchy was clear and unquestioned. They believed they understood their daughter, and then they discovered they didn't understand her at all. After I'd given them the house, I had a conversation with my brother and sister. I told them that I had approximately $340 million in investable assets and that if they were ever in genuine financial crisis, not want, not desire, but actual crisis, they could come to me for help. I told them that I had no interest in being asked for money casually or in being treated as a family bank or a financial solution to their problems. I told them that the help I offered would come with expectations and with transparency about how the money was being used and what outcomes I would require. My sister reacted with shock, followed by what looked like resentment. Resentment that I'd been wealthy while she was working 60-hour weeks as a doctor. Resentment that I hadn't mentioned this before. Resentment that suggested she felt somehow cheated or that I'd held out on her deliberately. My brother's reaction was more calculated. He started asking me for investment advice, positioning the relationship as one where he could potentially benefit from my financial expertise and guidance. What I realized through all of this was that revealing my wealth didn't actually make my family relationships better. It changed them fundamentally. It complicated them in ways that couldn't be undone. It introduced layers of dynamic that hadn't existed when they believed I was merely getting by. Did I regret buying my parents the house? No. I don't regret that at all. I wanted them to have the house. I wanted them to have the security and the joy of living in a property they dreamed about for decades. I wanted to give them something that genuinely mattered to them. But I did regret revealing the full extent of my wealth. Not because I shouldn't have revealed it, but because I learned something that I already suspected but hadn't wanted to confirm, that people's respect for you often isn't actually about who you are as a person or what you've accomplished, but about what you've achieved in ways that they can understand and measure and position within their own social framework. The $100 pity check became a metaphor for something deeper and more significant than just money. It represented my family's inability to see me accurately. It represented their assumptions about my financial situation and my capabilities. It represented their need to position me as less successful than they were, as someone who needed their help, as someone who hadn't made as good choices as they had. When I handed them the keys to the house, I said, "Thanks for the loan," which was technically a reference to the $100 check from Christmas morning, but which was also a deeper statement about gratitude for the unintended lessons that had emerged from years of misunderstanding.